Okay, hello all. My name is Chuck Bishop. I'm the Purchasing and Logistics Manager for Kindred Vines Import Company and Woodbury Wine. And today we're going to be talking about champagne. So for the past several years, I've been working with the purchasing team at Kindred Vines and Woodbury directly with our producers and suppliers from overseas and directly with our several champagne suppliers in the portfolio. So I recently, at the beginning of the year, had the privilege to travel to Champagne for my very first time, and it was an enormously educational experience for me. It was something that helped kind of wipe the stigma away from the subject of champagne a little bit more. It's something that I've always enjoyed, but as just a regular guy at certain times, it's been a little bit inaccessible in my life. But over the past several years, certainly developed a lot more of an interest and in traveling to the region and really experiencing a lot of the historical significance, a lot of the current complexities of what's going on, and really seeing what goes on a day-to-day basis really kind of opened up my eyes a little bit and helped me make a lot of sense of the region, of the wines, and unlocked some mysteries, so to say, for me. So, really excited to be here with you today and to go through some of what I know, what I've learned, and introduce you maybe to some concepts and some wines from the Kindred Vines and Woodbury wine portfolio. So, champagne really being the benchmark of the sparkling wine world, it's an important subject to at least be familiar with and know a little bit about, and be able to converse to help in the whole buying and selling process, and that's what we'll be talking about a little bit today. So to help us get a little bit acclimated, let's start with understanding a little bit about where we are and about the production of champagne. So Champagne is one of the more highly regulated wine producing regions in the world in terms of course, its borders and the area of growth, as well as within the production of the wine itself, with the varietals that can be included in a bottle of champagne, the grapes, that is, the planting density, how many vines can be grown per row, per hectare, etc., the yields at which you can pull off the vines at harvest in order to maintain the integrity of the wines and such, production methods when it comes to the making of champagne, as well as the aging, etc. So we'll talk a little bit about the region of the world where we're at and the subregions within Champagne. So as you can see, Champagne is the northernmost wine growing region within France, and it is, as a result, subject, of course, to some climate restrictions and certain characteristics that make the wine unique. Going into Champagne in the subregions itself, you have 5 specific zones, 5 specific growing zones, each with their own characteristics, whether it's geographically or in terms of the grapes that are grown there. So starting from the north, the Montagne de Reims. This is a region that I guess you might call the most prestigious of the regions, with it contains 10 of the 17 Grand Cru villages that exist in Champagne. We'll talk a little bit about the designations a little bit later. Within the Montagne de Reims, it's mostly Pinot Noir dominant. There are some Chardonnay vineyards there as well. Approximately 28% of the grapes grown in the Montagne de Reims are Chardonnay, but it is mostly Pinot Noir dominant. Next, we go a little bit south to the Vallée de la Marne. This is named after the valley that rolls along the Marne River. The main city in the region is Épernay, which is a really important city when it comes to Champagne. A lot of big houses, maisons are headquartered there, and the main focus, the main grape grown there is Pinot Meunier, which is one of the 3 main grapes grown in Champagne, and it of course is an important component in the area, and a lot of, like I said, a lot of the big houses, including some of ours in the Kindred Vines portfolio, come from the Vallée de la Marne. And you have the Côte de Blanc, This is where some of the other Grand Cru vineyards are within Champagne. So Grand Cru being the top, most highly prestigious vineyards. These have a lot of east-facing slopes, so facing towards the sun, getting a lot of ripening from the sun. And Chardonnay is the primary grape grown in this region. The Côte de Sézanne is now one of the, I guess I wouldn't call it one of the lesser regions. Certain people might not consider this one of the top wine growing regions within Champagne. Chardonnay is mostly grown here, but a lot of the vineyards are blended into bottlings for some of the larger houses, the larger maisons. We'll learn a little bit more about that strategy later, but this is an area where a lot of the grapes under vine are going bought in bulk and sent to some of the bigger houses to be grown in some of their flagship wines. Then you have the Côte de Bar, which is a region that is separate, non-contiguous with the other sub-regions within Champagne. This is further southeast, actually butts up against the northernmost region of Burgundy, which is Chablis, shares some of the same soil content that Chablis does, a little bit of marl there, and that's a little bit of a limestone mixed with clay, which give the wines there a little bit more of a rounder, riper characteristic. The Côte de Bar in the Aube province is a little bit, if you can call it, more up and coming. It's a little bit of a hot region right now, with a lot of wine growers kind of growing a little bit of a different style than the rest of Champagne. So it's a little bit in vogue right now. The climate. So the climate is certainly interesting in Champagne, being that it is the northernmost growing region, as I mentioned, in France, the northernmost major growing region. You get a lot of maritime influence from the north, which brings plenty of moisture to the area, which gives you a lot of rainfall, a lot of water, and that combined with some of the soil types we'll talk about in a minute, make sure that the vines there get plenty of water. But the duality of the climate up there with the continental climate as well, coming more from the south and from the east, also gives it a little bit of some danger when it comes to, as we see around here in the Midwest, a little bit of the colder continental temperatures that can come in and kind of wreak havoc with some frost and such. That's always an area in northern France, Champagne, along with Chablis as well, is really subject to a lot of frost threats and hail threats annually. But that continental climate also brings a lot more sunshine, which helps the ripening season as well within Champagne. The soil is certainly something that's some of the most unique, gives the most unique characteristics to Champagne. The chalk and limestone subsoil within the region from ancient calcareous deposits acts. It's a really porous limestone. It acts a little bit like a reservoir, housing a lot of water. The grapes certainly there never have the opportunity to go dry because of the absorption abilities of the clay or the limestone and chalk in that region, as well as the other landscape surrounding the vineyards within the region. There's a lot of forests, which help stabilize a lot of the temperatures and the climate within the region, giving it a little bit of that stability to help the growing region. And a lot of that water and the drainage really helps to grow and gives it a lot of the wines that the minerality and the acidity that Champagne is known for. So moving away from production areas into sourcing. I talked a little bit before about some of the larger houses, some of the maisons, and this is where that sourcing and the producer designation comes into play. There are two main types of producer designations in Champagne. It's a little unique compared to some other of the wine growing regions in France and in the world, where there's a very strict producer designation for the producers, the houses that are growing and producing the wines. So the two main designations you have are the NM and RM, the Négociant Manipulant and the Récoltant Manipulant, also known as grower Champagne. The Récoltant Manipulant is. There's a third more well-known growing producer designation, which is the cooperative manipulant, the CM, which you'll find wines such as the Champagne Montandon that we have here that Woodbury Wine carries. The cooperative is what it sounds like. A lot of producers growing from their own vineyards, pooling their resources and creating wines under label to get better economies of scale, better pricing, and more quality wines with the protections that they have there. But the Negociant Manipulant and the Récoltant Manipulant are the two more well-known producer designations right now. The Negociant status is the top producing producer designation that we have out there. These are a lot of the producers like Veuve Clicquot, Tanger, Perrier-Jouët, Moet. These are negociants, which are producers that buy from smaller growers around the region. They buy their grapes and juice in bulk, and they produce wines consistent with their style, bottling after bottling, year after year, and it allows them to create that larger scale and create wines that are more consistent, like I said, with their style. The Récoltant Manipulant, the grower champagne, are certainly the minority within the region, but have grown a lot of interest and favor and popularity over the years. As this is the more traditional style of the landowners, the producers growing at least 95% of their grapes on site, on their estate, and making the wine in their cellars. These are the growers of the grower champagne. It only accounts for 5% of the wine imported into the United States right now, but with the grower style, it allows a little more variation, a little more interest from bottling to bottling and vintage to vintage, whereas Negociant's bottlings are generally geared towards to be more consistent and predictable for the markets. So as I mentioned, Negociant Manipulant, these are not that different from a lot of Negociant bottlings that you may see in Bordeaux, in the Rhone Valley, and in other areas, in Burgundy. Not that far off, but in terms of their prestige, in terms of their overall notoriety, you'll see the majority of the big champagne houses that are recognized throughout the United States and other parts of the world. These are generally the Negociants. The Récoltant Manipulant, the grower champagne, these are the grape growers and their families growing it all on site and doing everything within their cellars and bottling under their own labels. So the Champagne Dumesnil, which I have here right now, and I'm currently enjoying, they are a grower champagne. They have their own site, their own production facility in Chigny-les-Roses and the Montagne de Reims, and they do everything. Everything is grown and bottled on site. That's not to say that you don't have certain producers that are negociants that fall under the larger houses that don't do the majority of the production on their own. So we have Champagne Souterrain, which is a Grand Cru producer from Ambonnay that they produce just north of 90% of all the grapes and the juice from their own estate. But since they're not at the 95% threshold, they can't call themselves a grower champagne. But everything they do is smaller production, really focused on quality and growth. And so it's there's a little bit of difficulty kind of differentiating between the Negociant and the Récoltant sometimes when you have a producer like that that's a smaller, essentially a grower producer, but falls under the larger designation just because they're not producing at least 95% of their own growth. So that is the grower champagne, a little bit of information there. And as I mentioned before, only 5% of the champagne imported into the United States is grower champagne. Moving on to quality levels. So quality levels are in Champagne are similar to some other areas like you'll find in Bordeaux with their Premier Cru and Grand Cru vineyards, or Burgundy and their Premier Cru and Grand Cru vineyards. Bordeaux has a different system set up with their classified growth system, but a similar idea. Vineyards, areas of a specific quality with historical focus on only the top quality can be designated as such in terms of their Premier and Grand Cru Vineyards. Dumesnil that I mentioned before, they are a Premier Cru grower producer. And then Champagne Souterrain, which I just had up here before, they are a Grand Cru producer in our portfolio. So you have those a little bit more recognizable quality levels. Then you move into some more unique designations like the Grand Marque and the Club Tresor designation. So Grand Marque, these are brands that you'll find some more recognized and well-known brands, like you know, some of the bigger houses, but these are known as you know, the great houses because they have you know, commitment to quality, and they are you know, essentially as it's provided in the name, they are great brands. So they have, you know, a long history from inception of you know, growth, continuous growth and development towards quality. And there are 24 champagne houses that are considered Grand Marque houses. One of ours in our book, Joseph Perrier, headquartered in Chalon-en-Champagne, is a Grand Marque house. They were also the preferred champagne house of Queen Victoria, which of course got them a little notoriety back in the day. But these are essentially, you know, recognized houses in terms of their great quality. And then finally we have the Club Tresor. So the Club Tresor was created in 1971. This is a little bit more of an independent grouping of producers, and it's an association of winemakers to advocate an approach to viticulture, not just winemaking. So both the, you know, the work in the vineyards as well as the winemaking, based on the utmost standards of quality. So it's 28 artisan growers, and they each submit to a blind tasting a specific vintage wine that fits all of the criteria of the Club Tresor, and a panel of enologists and winemakers blind taste the submissions of the members of Club Tresor, and those that are selected achieve special club status. So special club status is something that's very unique, as there are only the 28 growers within the Club Tresor out of thousands to begin with in Champagne. And to get the special club status for one of your wines is really an honor. And Champagne Dumesnil has had it the last couple of vintages that they've entered, the 2012 and 2013 vintages. So really proud to have those in our portfolio as well. A really unique designation, as I mentioned, when you consider all the producers and all the vineyards within Champagne. So going a little bit more into the structure of Champagne itself, into the basic building blocks of the wines, the grapes themselves, there are three main grapes that you'll find within a bottle of Champagne, and these are Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and Pinot Meunier. There are some smaller, lesser known grapes that are grown in smaller quantities that can be blended into legally a bottle of Champagne. But mostly you'll find Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and Pinot Meunier as the main building blocks of a bottle. So the Pinot Noir usually adds complexity and structure to a bottling. The Chardonnay, more freshness and delicacy to specific bottlings. And Pinot Meunier gives it a little bit more of fruitiness and a roundness. Pinot Meunier, a grape that you'll start to find a little bit more grown as a single varietal here and there, but generally it is a blending grape and more found within the Champagne region. And also a fun fact about the Champagne region, that there is a Vin Rouge AOC Champagne for still wines, still red wines made from Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier, the two red or black grapes that they designate there, that you can make into a still wine from the region, which is definitely very interesting. So going into a little bit of how Champagne is made and how we get the bubbles. So the traditional method of making Champagne is an ancient form of making sparkling wine, back from the days of Dom Perignon, the guy who founded the process. And so the traditional method of making sparkling wine with the secondary fermentation, the fermentation that creates the bubbles, happening inside the bottle, is made in this method champenois. So starting out, you'll get high quality, of course, wines that are grown and fermented and then blended into a cuvee. If that's what the winemaker chooses, you can also have a straight Blanc de Noir made from Pinot Noir, or of course a Blanc de Blanc made from Chardonnay. But the still fermentation of the dry wines first are created, and then they are formed essentially into what the winemaker wants to have at the end product. Then you have tirage, where the yeast and the sugars are added to the bottling to create the secondary fermentation. There is a crown cap put on the bottle, and the wines are set to age. We'll talk a little bit more about the aging, but for non-vintage, the minimum is 15 months. For vintage wines, 36 months is minimum aging time. And then you go through the process of riddling and disgorgement, which is basically slowly moving the spent yeasts or lees down from the bottling that they're aging upon down to the top of the bottling that's upside down. You freeze the top, expel the spent yeast through disgorgement, and then the winemaker adds a dosage, or a blending of sugar and still wine into the wine to determine the final sweetness level of said wine. Styles of champagne. So we talked a little bit about that dosage just now, and the style. So that's what makes, I think, champagne such an interesting category, because you have, of course, a very high quality still wine that is then made and transformed into something completely unique and different that you won't find anywhere else on earth. Of course, there's sparkling wine that you'll find in other places, and very high quality sparkling wine, but there's only one champagne, of course, with the history and tradition and the regulations on earth. So you have really the two varying factors that can create many different styles within a house of champagne. So your style, of course, first, you can see along the bottom here, you have, your vintage, your rosé, Blanc de Noir, made primarily from Pinot Noir grapes. You have your Blanc de Blanc from Chardonnay, and then you have your blends or cuvées, which sometimes can be a mixture of all three of the main grapes, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier, or just Pinot Noir or Chardonnay, whatever the house style in the terroir or the region calls for. So you have that as your base style, and then at the very end, when the dosage is added after the secondary fermentation, that's when you get the final sweetness levels in your wine. So you can have, you can have one style of wine that is made by the winemaker with two different dosage levels, and so it creates, a further continuation of the complexity of the wine, which makes this champagne and sparkling wine just so unique. And really a lot of fun to learn about and experiment in different types of situations. So the blend, most common types of champagne you'll see common blends, either equal parts of all three, or mostly Chardonnay in white from white, Blanc de Blanc, or Pinot Noir. You'll see it from black grapes, the Noir grapes. And the advantages of blends, you'll see a lot of, well-rounded. You can get a more specific style with your blend of what the winemaker is really going for. You can get a balance of the flavors, the ripeness, the roundness, the freshness, acidity, and you can play to a specific house's or region's strength with the blends. Blanc de Blanc, as I mentioned before, made of 100% Chardonnay, white grapes, more focus on the freshness and delicacy with the chalky and limestone soils. And the Chardonnay, really a lot of freshness, a lot of acidity. Sometimes the grapes are picked even a little bit earlier before they're completely ripe to maintain that acidity throughout the aging process. So depending on whether it's a non-vintage or vintage wine, after it's aged for so many years, it'll still maintain that delicacy and freshness. And with the Blanc de Blancs, you'll see a lot of the white flower, citrus, apple, tree fruit notes, as well as mineral. Blanc de Noir, made from 100% black grapes, or red grapes, the Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier. There's a more focus, of course, there on the fruity flavors with those wines, and aromatic complexity. Common flavors, generally strawberry, blackberry, some plum, figs, sea salt, minerality, and a lot of richness with the Blanc de Noir. As you move along the spectrum, they can really hold their own, beyond just drinking on their own, but with food and complementing as well. and rosé. So of course we all love rosé. There's two different types of traditionally accepted ways to make rosé and champagne. This is our Charles Orban Brut Rosé. This is a blend where generally the red wine, still wine, is blended in with the white wine to create the rosé. There's also, as in with still rosé wines, the Rosé de Saignée, which is essentially the grape must being macerated along with the red grape skins to extract the color, and then that juice is then bled off, hence the name Saignée, Rosé de Saignée, to create the Saignée. Generally, you'll see those as darker, more complex rosé wines. Champagne Souterrain makes a Rosé de Saignée, but the majority of the rosé you'll see is a blending tactic. And within there, you see a lot of red fruit, citrus, floral notes, violet rosewater, and even lighter fresh stone fruit, peaches, apricot. And then vintage wines. So we mentioned before a little bit more about the aging aspect of champagne and the regulations that go along with that. Non-vintage wines required a minimum of 15 months. Vintage wines age for a minimum of 3 years. Now, you'll see the majority of the champagne producers out there will be aging for longer than that to make sure that they can get the style that they want. It's not necessarily about churning out as much product as possible for a lot of producers, especially the ones that we work with. But these are just the stated minimum regulations. But like I said, for a special vintage, a special bottling, especially a producer's top cuvee, you'll see age being a lot longer than 3 years, 5 to 7 years being an acceptable term. And along with that aging, as the wines are sitting there aging on their lees or the yeast, you're getting extracting a lot of yeast and bready, brioche, biscuity notes. A lot of cream from the fermentation as well. A lot of creamy textures, malolactic fermentation, and a lot of fullness. A lot of fullness from those wines because of the length of aging on the lees, but because of the purposeful inclusion of a lot of acid in the early base wines, you'll still see and maintain a lot of freshness even through years and years of aging. Selling champagne. So here's we get to the point where it's a little bit of a tricky part of the process. It's fun to work with champagne producers. It's fun to drink champagne. Guilty as charged. I love to drink it, but of course, it's not always accessible to the average consumer. And so we have to be sensitive of that, and we have to be aware also that champagne in itself, as I mentioned before, is a totally unique wine product, and it's a totally unique experience. And I think this is why it has the elevation, a little bit the mystique, and some of the stigma that it has. But if we explain a little bit more and learn a little bit more about that and experience it more, we understand that due to the extreme time of aging and the labor that goes into it, the patience, the process. When you think about champagne, the final bottling as compared to some of the other wines that you'll see from other growing regions with a little bit more of a kind of a scarcity value to them, maybe some of the cult wines that have a price on them because of a name or from a region. The labor of love that goes into a lot of champagne bottlings, especially from some of these smaller houses, it's arguable, but it's well worth maybe some of the money that you spend on them just to have the story and have the experience of something that's aging 7+ years in a cellar in a cave beneath a centuries old producer, which is a very cool concept and experience once you can explore it a little bit. So this phrase of everybody loves to drink champagne but nobody loves to buy it, we can't necessarily argue against that. But some of these common objections, it is too expensive. Maybe I'm not celebrating. I'm not sure what I'm going to like, what style I'm going to like. Is it going to be too dry, too sweet? Will it really go well with my meal? Which is a big factor of champagne, which is being acclimated more into daily drinking life more and more recently, but still a challenge for some folks. So when you find, maybe it's a couple out to dinner or an individual, that is a little bit more cost conscious, which is completely understandable. Fortunately, a lot of producers, Champagne du Mesnil being one of them that we have some coming in, You can find a lot of bottlings in the half bottle, the 375 milliliter size, or the split, commonly known as split, the 187 1/4 of a bottle size, which is generally, a glass of wine that can be offered either at a restaurant or a retail shop, where somebody can try it out and see if they like a style, see if they like a certain producer. This opens up a lot more possibilities for more people to access and try the product. Then you have somebody, maybe it's already a wine connoisseur, somebody that is maybe has a little bit of a collection, that is a little bit more experienced, looking for something new. In my mind, champagne is something that offers that extra sensory experience, with the sweetness levels, with the acidity, with the freshness, with the bubbles. It's a completely different experience. You have a very, very top quality still wine that has extra layers on top of it, that is really offering something very, very much more for a style. So, that texture, that lees aging, the blending, sweetness levels really offer a lot more on top of, the standard Chardonnay or Pinot Noir or other red wine that somebody's going to have. So I think that expanding and pushing people's boundaries a little bit is something that is, something that champagne can take on very easily. Of course, the group of friends looking to have a good time. This is, what everybody kind of thinks of, the celebration aspect of champagne, but it's more than just the, retirement party or birthday type situation. This is somebody that's looking for maybe to start their night off with something fun and a little more vibrant. Generally, champagne being a little bit lower alcohol, it's something that you can start off with and kind of, refresh yourself and have a good time with. There is always the prestige and exclusivity aspect of champagne, which is fun, in an easy way to sell it. But it's, it's not all that there is to offer. And, everybody enjoys the bubbles. It's fun. It's something to talk about, and it's experience to have. So it's, I think, a great way to kind of start off, celebrate a night, or start off an evening with some friends, something to talk about, a talking point, start off an evening meal, or combine with food. You have another customer at your restaurant, the bar customer that says, "Surprise me with something," and a glass of bubbles always put a smile on people's face. Look at somebody when they get a bottle of bubbles put in front of them, or a glass of bubbles. It's an enjoyable experience. It's fun, and it's a great talking point. Maybe somebody had a great time or a celebration with a bottle of champagne or a glass, and so it's fun to reminisce. It's fun to have that talking point, and something that's unique. And it really does, with the bubbles, with the freshness, with the acidity. It's a beverage that can really wake up and expand the palate, and wake up the other senses for a future food or beverage experience. As we move into the food aspect, this is something I think that maybe not as commonly recently, but it's something that's overlooked as an aspect of champagne. Is something that can go extremely well with food. If, of course, it's not always the easiest opportunity to have a 4 or 5 course champagne dinner, but champagne paired with a meal with a certain style, whether it's a fresh, acidic champagne with something fatty, even champagne and fried chicken is a hugely popular pairing. Something very simple, but in terms of the acid and the fats, is something that, and the saltiness, that and the minerality, that really go together and mesh. But you can even move into something with a little more texture and more body, a Blanc de Noir, rosé, with things like a pork or a barbecue and such. That the body of a champagne, its strength, it's built up, and it can withstand a lot of different various food experiences. So that it's an easy push, and something that I think that, as long as somebody's willing to have the experience, is something that's very rewarding. Of course, opportunity, if the opportunity presents itself, which it doesn't always to everybody, but it's something that really, really should be tried a lot more with food. So that's our little champagne staff training seminar. It's, of course, as with any subject, with any wine, there's tons of rabbit holes to be able to go down that we didn't, of course, cover today. But champagne as a category, as a region, as an identity, is something that is well worth exploring, and a lot of fun once you can get into it and have, if you're fortunate enough to have those experiences. It can be a lot of fun. So Thank you to Kindred Vines, Woodbury Wine. Thank you, Emily Kemner, for putting all this, helping me put this together. And cheers.